is still as intense now as it was, way back when, is it?
I'm not a regular attender of games or anything, but when my son was looking at colleges, it very much was still, and that wasn't very long ago. So yes, it probably is.
Probably is, right. So, there are storied college rivalries everywhere, but Stanford versus Berkeley is a big one. But anyway, and I mentioned the college because there's a college background in this story, which is called Before She Finds Me. Great cover, by the way. So it's not really a dark academic mystery in the sense that, it's the life of the college that, at least I don't classify it as one where that's the case. Much of the action is by people who aren't actually enrolled at the college. But Julia, one of the main characters, is a professor there. And I was interested to see, Heather, in your note, you said that you actually know zip about botany, but you took a shot at making her a botany professor. So that was pretty brave of you. If you're a person who kills plants, including the fake fiddle leaf in your living room, as you point out, why'd you decide to give her botany as an expertise?
It was part of the story as I envisioned it. And I was like, oh no, that means I have to go figure this out, because I was not exaggerating. My friend gave me this ficus she'd had for 20 years and said, oh, there's no one who can kill this. It was dead within a month. It's just I'm just not good with plants. So, but it just, I knew Ren was someone who liked to poison people and was a little bit obsessed with poison flowers and plants. And so it made sense for Julia. I had always envisioned her to be on the campus. I just didn't know in what capacity. And then so when I decided with my editors, like, hey, why don't we do that? I was like, okay, let's see what botany professors I can talk to. And luckily people are always so generous with their knowledge when you reach out about, something they're so knowledgeable and passionate about. So, that was the path. It was through research. So I know more about flowers now, and
Good for you. Right. I mean, you can now buy cut flowers at the Safeway. You don't even have to go to a florist. There used to be much more of a flower culture. Phoenix, for example, had these beautiful Japanese gardens that were famous, but eventually development, paved right over them on the way to another round of apartment buildings. So I understand it. This is a total digression, but I'll mention it anyway. So I understand that Hokkaido, which is the northernmost isle of Japan, is now one of the major sources for cut flowers.
oh, I did not know that. We learned something new, don't we?
Right. You can incorporate it into another book should you want to do that. So you've actually written two earlier books, one, No Bad Deed, and Blood Will Tell. So you're a fan of standalone rather than series kinds of stories. Is that right?
That is, I've always been drawn to stories that have a family at its core that's being tested in an unusual way. And because of that, it's kind of would be very challenging to say, okay, how you had this murder, now you have another murder, so yeah, it very much lends itself to more of a standalone, though there are some characters like the character of Ren that I was like, I would have loved to explore her in different ways. Because she is a different type of character in that she can be involved in murder a lot because she's an assassin, but the usual suburban mom moving her daughter into college, less so. She's not going to have too many murders on her doorstep, hopefully.
Well, I think, a distinction. I had a really interesting conversation with Riley Sager about this Monday night when we launched his new book, because he actually wrote 3 or maybe 4 books in a series before he adopted a new name and started over writing standalones. And he really likes that because, for one thing, it's hard. I've talked to other authors about this too. If you put people through the kind of ringer that you put them through, it's really hard to go back and torture them again. I mean, they sort of deserve to, if they survive. And that's another thing, is that not everyone in a book like this is guaranteed to survive. as opposed to in a series where at least one character, the series lead, is always going to survive. It puts everybody in jeopardy, but it's also more realistic to think this is the worst thing that will ever happen to these people. And either they'll make it through or they won't. And if they make it through, then the reader gets to imagine, what kind of life they might lead. So you have two women in this story who they're other characters, but to a great degree, they're the two poles in this story. One's called Julia and one's called Rin. So why don't you tell us about them and maybe how you arrived at the two of them?
Well, it was my first truly dual point of view novel. And I arrived at the character of Julia first because she came to be when I was, moving my own daughter into the college dorms. And I was thinking, what's the worst that could happen? Let's make that happen. And so I always had her as the character. I knew she was going to be a single mom and that she was going to have this very deep connection with Cora that makes her a little bit, protective of, every, parent is protective, but, she has seen some pretty bad things and she knows what's out there and she's spent her whole life trying to protect Cora. And then the worst does happen. And I always knew I wanted to start in that way, but I didn't really know where I wanted to go from there. And then I was interviewing a colleague who happened to be very pregnant and also had a husband who cloned carnivorous plants. And so all of a sudden, it was very fortuitous. She's a very nice person, nothing like Ren, but I all of a sudden had this idea of like, that's the foil, it's going to be dual point of view. It's going to be a cat and mouse thriller. And so I needed to have two equally weighted, equally, determined women at its core. And I wanted them very much on parallel tracks to, intersect and, great chaos and conflict. So I always knew I wanted to have these two women characters at the core of the story. And that's kind of how it evolved. And I knew that Ren would be somewhat her social circles, because she's a pregnant assassin who, doesn't have a lot of friends. She deals with people that are pretty bad people. And so she's never really had a friend. And so Julia represents everything she hasn't had. So I wanted there to be this certain fascination. And I had to figure out what would make someone like Ren, who sees the bad in so many people, see Julia and how they could be at odds with one another. So they are a lot alike, but they're also very, very different.
So Julia is a college professor. Her husband, Eric, has divorced her and has remarried to a woman named Bree, who's actually kind of a third pole in this book. Although in the opening, it's not any spoiler to describe the opening scene, which we'll do in a minute. So Bree is not really with us throughout the novel, at least alive. And Julia has a daughter called Cora, who is enrolling in college. So it's one of those awful post-divorce moments when you take your daughter to college and your ex-husband shows up with his, new wife. And it's one of those awkward moments that nobody really knows how to get through very well, especially if the new wife is, bitchy or at least difficult. And you don't want to make a scene and embarrass the child who's, got two parents there and doesn't really want to be in that fight. So that's one. Now, tell us a little more about Ren, because Ren is not a single actor in this drama.
Yeah, Ren is a newly pregnant assassin who was raised into the trade by her father, who was a single father who had some issues around trust and some life circumstances that kind of led him to choose this career. And Ren is, he's trained her with this mantra about, kill the innocent. I mean, excuse me, not kill the innocent, kill the guilty,
Right.
protect the innocent, and defend the family. And so she's been brought up with this mantra her whole life. And, then she met and married a man in the trade as well. And so she has a very limited worldview. On the one hand, she is a very, strong woman, and on the other, she's kind of also a little bit naive, because she is a, somewhat awkward socially, and she doesn't have a lot of experience in that realm. So she has definitely a very complicated history, and that is actually part of what draws her to Julia, is that Julia also has a complicated relationship and backstory with her parents. And so it's another way that they're kind of on the same mirrors of each other, but at the same time, very, very different. So, if they'd been different people, maybe they would have been friends. But, they're on the opposite sides of this fight. So, yeah, so that was Ren. She, and again, is obsessed with poisonous plants. And when she learns that Julia is a botany professor and also clones carnivorous plants in her free time, she, becomes even more fascinated with her.
But what is the incident that gets them? I mean, because in normal circumstances, they never would have met. So what is it that happens at the outset of your novel? We can at least talk about that.
We can, yeah.
That sets up this, duality, and also the cat and mouse game that ensues.
Ren is married to the hired killer who was on campus that day. And she and him, Nolan is his name. She and Nolan plan, she plans the jobs, he executes them. Sometimes she'll execute them too, but they always work in tandem, and they always work according to this very meticulous planning that she does. She makes her kill maps, and, she has a certain way of doing things, and he's always, done the same. He's always respected her role in their partnership. And so this is unusual in that she didn't know about this one. He didn't tell her about this one. And so that kind of, Julia wants to know, hey, why did this horrible thing happen that put my daughter in grave danger? And Ren is wondering, why did my husband do this terrible thing without checking with me first? So
right. So it appears that there's just a shooter on campus, and it's tragically every day there's another, random shooter somewhere, anywhere. I mean, there's really nowhere safe at this point. You could be in the gas station or at the 7-Eleven or, in a doctor's office, and all. There's just people with guns and hair trigger tempers. It's amazing. I don't think I've opened the Arizona Republic in the last year where there hasn't been at least one shooting. Most of them, not clever, meticulous assassinations or anything, but just people who have a gun and, lose control or whatever it is. I mean, it's just, if the idea of all this gun thing is to keep us safe, it's actually working entirely in the opposite. But so anyway, here's Julia. It's enrollment day or whatever it is, or welcome to campus day. And, a shot rings out, and she recognizes what's happening more quickly than anybody else. So she falls upon Cora to protect her, but other people aren't so lucky.
Yeah, of course, when that germ of the idea was very much driven by the worst that I could imagine happening in that moment. And you're absolutely right. I mean, my daughter's school was locked down because of it ended up being a replica BB gun on campus on graduation day. I mean, you can't escape it these days, either. It's just, it's the most terrifying thing I can think of as a parent. I remember getting the text on graduation day, I'm okay. And I'm like, why wouldn't you be? Please, tell me. And So those are the kind of texts you don't want to get from your children, but I mean, not getting them, I and I think that was part of my process with this, and I know I'm getting way off track, was to work through this complicated, you know, issue we have in our country. And it was a way of me, writing's always been cathartic for me. And so it was a way coming to terms with my own thoughts and feelings about it. So I mean, yeah, there's that. And I'm sure I just totally blew past whatever question it was you asked.
You did fine. I mean, it's an interesting scene, and when you read it, you go right past a couple of clues that Heather very kindly puts in. And I was impelled to go back and read the opening scene at some point during the book in order to, when I appreciated it. We're certainly not going to tell you what those things are, so because you'll have the same experience. So did it spring fully to your mind, or did you have to put some real effort into setting up that whole first chapter?
I always, I think a lot of authors spend a lot of time on that first chapter. I try not to get so mired in it that it doesn't allow me to continue to explore the story. By explore, I'm totally an outliner, but still it surprises me sometimes. And it is, through that process of discovery, I'm like, oh, I need to go plant more clues.
Right.
So I would say it was, as far as intent and structure in that first scene, it probably was 65% fully formed. And then it started to be layering. The way things happened was always going to go that way. That wasn't a surprise. But as I kind of honed in on what I wanted to say and how I wanted it to end, and the midpoint and all those mileposts along the way, it did kind of surprise me a little bit, because I envisioned the first scene and the climax almost simultaneously, which almost never happens. It was like I could see them as if they were a movie in my head. And then I'm like, how do I get from there to here? Was the surprising part. So I did go back and I make sure that it was supported, because I mean, ultimately we want to surprise readers, but we want them also to be satisfied. We don't want them to say, I didn't get that because that's totally doesn't, that wasn't supported. I don't even hate it if someone says, hey, I figured it out, because that means the clues are there.
Right.
But I don't want, I think it would be far worse to have a reader say, where did this come from? It doesn't make any sense. I think that would be a far worse thing than I figured it out, because thriller readers are smart. Some of them will figure it out, and that's okay.
No, it is okay. And of course, you don't know what to look for. So, that helps with the misdirection. It's only later that you recognize that, there was something there that you could have seen, but at the time didn't appear to be important. So you always knew how. I was going to ask you that, you always knew how it would come out. I thought you might have debated some about, sadly, we can't talk to you about this, but I thought you might have debated some about the final outcome.
Well, there are several things. I mean, the climax is pretty rich with stuff.
Yeah. Well, the final but one. Anyway, as we mentioned, it's an interesting question in a book like this about who survives. So, since everyone could actually be killed, then I think making choices about that, the reader should not be able to expect, who's going to live and who's going to die in a book like this. So, sometimes in a cat and mouse game, both the cat and the mouse die. It's not necessarily true that one will win.
Yeah, and I think you are correct in saying there were things that I knew were going to happen. big moments in the finale that I knew were going to happen. But I also want to be a little bit surprised by how the final conflict ends. Because if it's too like paint by numbers,
Yeah.
then it won't be fun for readers. It won't be fun for me to write. I want to kind of explore it, and like, I want there to be real, tension over who is going to survive this. And I think if I know, then I know in draft 2. In draft 1, I don't always know.
Oh, so do you, I see you had quite a large writer circle because you mentioned a whole bunch of names in the back. Was this a book that, you shared with others as you went along, or how do you work with other authors when you're involved in a circle?
I wrote my first book totally in a bubble. I wrote it, no one read it. I had a friend read it, the first draft, and then I tore it up and changed it from 3 points of view, third person, to a single point of view. And the first person to read that book was my agent. No one read it before then. And so it was about finding my voice and learning. I'd written practice books, but it was where I really kind of felt excited. And books 2 and 3, I kind of built my community, and I no longer had to be in a bubble. And so that's the thing that's so great. And also I was part of a debut group, the 2020 debuts.
Mm-hmm.
And we were forged in fire. I mean, and so I think that really helped us with this shared experience that we had. Some of us are still in touch, and I think we will be, because you go through things that nobody else has gone through, and you can talk to people about things that you can talk to and have people understand. But as far as who sees my writing and who, like, I'm try to go easy on my husband with the questions, like, what do you think about this? Where do you think we should bury this body? What do you think about, does this make sense? My children too, especially my daughter, I will bounce ideas. She's 21, she can read this kind of stuff. I'll bounce ideas off her, like, what do you think? Which do you think is better? The difference with this book is I think I bounced more ideas off writer friends. This was the one where I was able to say, hey, person who actually writes the same kind of stuff that I do you think A or B is better? And that's the first time I've done that. So it was kind of almost joyful experience, finding that community and being able to connect to in a way. And I just went to Thriller Fest, and it was so fun to spend a weekend with a whole group of people whose eyes don't glaze over when you're talking about your book for the 15th time.
I know. I wanted to go to Thriller Fest, and I was enrolled, and my husband suddenly had to have cervical spine surgery on May 16th, and he can't drive, and he's all right now, but he couldn't drive and he couldn't pick up anything. We have 3 dogs, and so I wound up telling Kimberly I would just donate my membership this year because, I couldn't go off and leave him for several days. But I was sad, because you're right. It is wonderful to go and do that. The San Diego VoucherCon is a mystery gathering. Thriller Fest is more specifically targeted towards people who write thrillers. That it's also more of a professional gathering instead of a fan gathering, which VoucherCon and other conferences like Left Coast Crime, so forth, are. But anyway, it'll be great to go. We went to VoucherCon last year, and then since we were in St. Paul, and I had always wanted to go down the Mississippi as the only major river we haven't actually gone down, I couldn't resist leaving on Friday and taking a riverboat down to St. Louis, which was great. So I didn't spend the whole weekend in Minneapolis, but it was nice to see people excited about getting together again. after, both virtual ones, and then weather wiped out one. I'm trying to remember. It's been an unlucky convention, but it was nice to see it back on track. And we'll hope the hurricane season doesn't come blowing through San Diego.
Are you going to Buckeye?
I am, yes. Now I'm
Good to see
going, and I'm really looking forward to it, since Thriller Fest didn't work out. And I've also signed up for the Nashville one, which will be at the same season next year. And that's another thing for those of you who are watching. If you have a chance, it's great to go to those conferences as a fan, because you get to interact with other fans who don't think you're weird being a fan. But you also get to go to different places, because that's part of the point. Thriller Fest is, the first one was here because I actually started Thriller Fest, and they had it here in Arizona in July. And I said to them, this is not a good idea to have a big conference in Phoenix in July. Yeah, it's just too hot and whatever. So anyway, they took it to New York, where it actually gathers. But the other conferences move around. And so you get a chance to explore different communities, different writer communities, different book selling communities. It's all great. Now I've lost track of what it was. Oh, I know what I was I think I know what I was. Hold on while the thought comes back to me.
I will say that was my last year's Thriller Fest was the first conference I'd ever been to of any kind ever.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
So it really was a big experience for you.
It was an amazing experience. And now that I've gone to this Thriller Fest, it makes 2. So BoucherCon will be 3. I really was in a bubble. I was so excited about going to the one in 2020.
Yeah, well, it was nice to, as you say, to get out again. So what were your, it'll come back to me what I was going to ask you about the writers thing, but let's go back. And what were your first 2 books? Do you want to give us a little précis of the first 2?
They were both standalones, as you've mentioned. No Bad Deed is about a good Samaritan who sees a couple fighting alongside the road and stops to help. And then the attacker, tells her, let her die and I'll let you live. And she, of course, is not about to do that. And she intercedes, and the sirens chase the guy away, but he escapes with her van and her ID and everything. And so then her life starts to fall apart. And she's like, her husband goes missing, and she's wondering, is this connected? And Blood Will Tell is about it starts with, I love my first scenes. I love writing first scenes. I could write 100 first scenes. Like, can we do that? Can we just write 100 first scenes? But Frankie is stopped at a gas station. There's an Amber Alert. Her truck has been spotted at an abduction. And it's not the first time that she's been linked through her sister, her younger sister, who she feels very maternal, because there's a big age difference, and she also helped raise her. And so she is, 6 years or 5 years before, 6 friends went partying and the game got out of hand, and only 5 returned. And so now there's another missing girl, and Izzy might be involved. So she's torn between protecting her sister and finding out the truth.
Got it. Now I've remembered what I was going to ask you, because you said other people who write stuff like me, or you probably said it more elegantly. What is it that you think you write when you say stuff like me or books like me? What does that mean to you?
Well, I would say in general, thrillers and suspense. I would say on a more granular level, I think I tend to write domestic thrillers where people are, and they can be a little dark and pacey and twisty and that kind of thing. So, and also pretty much, the book I'm working on too fits this mold. So maybe book 5, probably not, but actually definitely not. Strong female characters. And when I say strong, I sometimes hesitate to use that word because, what is strong, and why should we have to be strong? I mean, we should be able to be flawed and complicated and weak sometimes, and we should be all of those things. So when I talk of strength, I talk of it as, mental, emotional, and some physical, if depending on the character. But the truth is that a botanist single mom is not going to solve the problem the same way as a pregnant assassin. I mean, just not. And so, when I say strong, I maybe better word would be complicated.
Yeah, well, complicated works. Although I have to say that in this book, both the botanist,
Yeah.
cactus raising single mom and the pregnant assassin are both, I mean, it's a real duel between the two of them. So in their different way, they're equally strong. But I've had, I do this, once or twice a day. I've had a lot of conversations with authors this spring, women authors, about a lot of books that are fueled by female rage. And, I think that has become, I've been two or three, the female serial killer has emerged. And part of it seems to be rooted in female rage over, one thing or another. Rin is not a serial killer. She has things to be angry about, but she's a professional, focused. She's not driven by, even though she's had difficult things in her past, she's not out seeking revenge. I mean, we're using that word a lot at the moment, revenge travel, revenge shopping, whatever it might be, which I don't think is actually a good word, to be using it. I think it's just a pent up, I don't think it's revenge in the sense you can't be angry at travel, which is an inchoate, word. I think you can feel you were deprived of travel or you got stifled or whatever it might be. But revenge to me always implies, a target that can act, and travel can't do that. So, but I am seeing a lot of really angry women, for one reason or another, and they erupt in violence, and not necessarily professionally, but more in an amateur way. They sort of stumble into serial killing, without, there's no serial killer training school, for example. And male serial killers generally, although not always, have acted alone historically and in fiction, although there have been those pairs like Myra Hindley and whatever the name of her boyfriend was, where you get a folie à deux thing where you have two people who separately might not have gone off the rails, but together, the fusion of them does send them off into some kind of a spiral. Wasn't Robert Starkweather, I think, whatever his name was, the Kansas guy, Robert or Charles, maybe it's Charles. Anyway, so you get that. But, a killer, I mean, somebody like Rin is really interesting in that, she's not, it's not a folie à deux thing, two people being crazy together. She's not, striking blindly out of rage at random targets, for example. She's a real assassin. So why did you decide to make her that way? Was that necessary for the cat and mouse game that you created? She had to be focused.
I really wanted to explore a character unlike a character that I had created before. And I also like the freedom of Ren. And I think that's why I made her a pregnant assassin. The image, I mentioned that the climax and the first scene kind of came fully formed in not exactly how they ended up being, but pretty close. Ren's opening, when I thought of Ren, I thought of her first scene, that moment, not the whole scene, but that moment that she is pregnant, and she's just newly pregnant, but she's starting to show the baby bump, and she is trying on a gun holster and trying to figure out, hey, I've got to change things up because my body's changing. And I saw her at the rack when I saw the character. And so she just came to me like that. I liked the idea of, with my characters are not like, I mean, they share bits of me. For instance, Cassie in my first book has real guilt over work-life balance, and I did too as a working mom. And then, I was raised by a single mom. I was, moving my daughter into college. I mean, there's like obviously parallels,
Mhm.
but Ren was not like me. And it was fun because I got to say, oh, Rin wouldn't do that. Oh, yeah, she would do that. And, which was different. You have this certain expectations of your single mom botanist. She's, a woman of academia. She's a nurturer who's been caring for her daughter and raised her pretty much by herself for 18 years. And you have certain expectations, and she's not going to suddenly go and poison someone. I mean, she might, but it would be a harder sell, I think. Whereas Ren had such freedom. And that's why it was so fun to write, because I could do anything. Within her character. She's pretty rigid actually, but I liked the freedom to be like, who knows how this will end up? We really don't. And part of me was inspired by, of course, Killing Eve, who doesn't love that, and the books that inspired them. But at the same time, that's a very different dynamic. And I wanted it to be kind of like a domestic thriller, but she's worried her husband might be lying to her. He's hiding things from her. She's pregnant. It's affecting her body. She has to go to the bathroom all the time. She's slower than she used to be. And oh yeah, she kills people. So I mean, it's kind of like how an assassin might also be married and raising a family. I mean, that idea was like really interesting to me. So.
Well, I mean, I think a real question is certainly a question that occurred to me is that is she's a professional assassin who has to be in tip-top physical shape, and given her background and so forth, she doesn't have to stay pregnant. I mean, why has she decided to keep the baby? I mean, right, we're in the middle of all this abortion hot button stuff, but she would in today be able to, safely have an abortion somewhere anyway. Why would she choose not to do that? Because the baby seems like the last thing that ought to be part of both her professional and her personal life.
I envision her, especially as the book starts, as being very much in love with her husband, attracted to her husband, and also really respectful and loving with her dad. And I feel like she loves the idea of family, and she doesn't see why she can't do both. She's like, at one point in the book, she's thinking, this pregnancy thing is kind of rocks, because people never suspect a pregnant woman. And so she's suddenly thinking, maybe I should even take this further, like pretend to be pregnant when I'm not. So I think she doesn't see it as an either or. I think she just figures, like at one point, even Nolan says, maybe I'll take up more of the jobs. And yeah, she's not having any of that. She's like, I can do both.
She can do both while she's pregnant, but childcare is a whole nother issue. And this has come up over the years, even in, the cozy crime field and so forth. I've been doing this for 33 years, so I've been able to trace these tropes for a really long time. And it was always a very critical issue, not so much about being pregnant, but about if you have a child dependent on you, how much risk can you afford to put yourself in? What effect will that be for the child? Who's going to raise this child if in the course of, your work, you're going to get killed or going to get hurt? So, I mean, to do this, Rin must really have some vision of herself as invulnerable. It must not really occur to her that she could have this baby and then get killed on the job, and there would the child be. I don't
Yeah.
think she's doing long range thinking, I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, I think she also, we're talking to her, and I think she also feels as if she's doing the world a service, and there are sacrifices and if she has to sacrifice herself, and her father's retired, I think she thinks of that as a safety net. We don't want to go too deeply into the book itself, other than, that she does at the beginning of the book, she does think she has a very strong support system. It may be limited, but she does feel connected to her husband and connected to her father. And so I think there's a little bit of that. And there's also a little bit of the fact we kind of are our trauma, and she has been raised this way where this is like, what else would she do? What other possible life does she have?
Yeah.
That being said, as a pregnancy does become real to her, more real to her, she does start to question what she's doing a little bit, but I think you're right that she does feel somewhat invulnerable. I mean, she feels invulnerable in the way that she feels like she's doing something important. And I don't think, even though she sees death all the time, I don't think she sees vulnerability within herself.
Right. I don't either.
She's really good at what she does. I mean, I think she does say that, like, at a few junctions, she talks about how it's an art, as much as a science, because if she wasn't really good at what she did, she's approaching people double her size, and she has never been injured. She feels vulnerable because she kind of has been. And
right. She reminds me of a teenager kind of in that respect. I mean, some of the great war heroes like Audie Murphy and so forth, one reason they were fabulous war heroes is they were like teenagers and didn't occur to them that, they could actually be shot and die, or, be shot and hurt. There's that whole teenage attitude. And, I mean, I'm actually like Julia. We're talking about Rin almost all the time here, but I think Julia is, to me anyway, in many ways, the more interesting character, or at least as interesting character, because, here she is, she's a mom and a professor, and, trying to navigate without a husband that she still feels like she ought to text an update about how their daughter's doing and so forth. And yet, she has to find resources, because, I mean, this does become a physical and very dangerous cat and mouse game. It's not like she's outfoxing her in the office playing, Clue or something like that, So I really think they're very well matched. And you did a great job with that, that it's a real question which one of them is going to make it through, and what's the goal of each one. Julia's, I don't think, really evolves. Her goal is pretty clear all the way through. So Rin's the character more on a journey. And if part of the story is a quest, then that's sort of where that works out.
Yeah, I think that with Rin also, that was a pretty apt analogy as far as her being a teenager, because they do have a sense of invulnerability, and she is a little bit socially and emotionally more stunted than Julia.
Yeah.
Julia has, in some ways she's more protected than Julia. And so she does have a different way of looking at the world. Sometimes I think, what would the book have been if instead of pregnant, she had a toddler? I don't know. I mean, obviously it would be a different book. Obviously it would be a different book because she would have already gotten to a stage where she sees the baby is more real now. But yeah, Julia, I loved writing Julia too. I mean, the thing about Julia is she is, she has all the corny puns, and she has this deep love for her daughter, and she's a little bit goofy in some ways, but she's also got a pretty dark past too. And the fact that she has to deal with her own trauma, it just, and how she does it, that's different, how she reacts, that's a complete, different tact than.
Absolutely. No, she's a survivor, and as a survivor, she's protected. We're having this conversation like these are real people that we could have gone and had coffee with or something, And that's a mark, I think, of successful characterization, is that you can actually have a discussion about what it would be like. And it's interesting. Readers bring their own stuff, to character and to story, and everybody reads a book differently. If there's one thing I have learned doing this for so long, and if you run a book club or stand at the counter, checking people out or something, you recognize that authors often don't see it right away. That every person reads a book differently. So your job as an author, once you publish the book and you put it out there, is done. But really, it's every reader that then takes your book and makes it whatever it turns out to be. So that's fascinating. Well, I usually ask if you're working on another book, but you've already mentioned that you're doing that, so we're safe there. Right. So that part's great. Let's call Jacob up and see if anybody has followed this discussion long enough to have a question. Now you're blinded by the sun. Sorry, sweetie.
It's okay. Hi, Heather. We had a few questions regarding. Okay, here's this one. How have you changed as a writer since your first book?
Well, the first time I met my editor, I have a new editor for this third book. And the first time I met her, I said, the first book I found my voice, the second book I found my process, and the third book I found my joy. And I think that's kind of how I've changed. I think, like I mentioned, I wrote 3.25 practice books before I wrote No Bad Deed.
Oh.
And so it was really about finding the confidence to write what I wanted to write in the voice I wanted to write, because a lot of the books I grew up writing were, very male driven, third person. There was a certain structure to them. And then I started reading more, female protagonist driven fiction. And I was like, I really, my book was from a male point of view, the one I was writing. And I was like, no, this is not the book I need to write the first. And then I wrote No Bad Deed. And then I actually changed her to a first person because I wanted to get close. I wanted to get intimate with her. I wanted to know her. And that just felt like a natural choice because my 3 practice books were all third person. So, I did change like that way. And then now I'm back to third person with this book, but it also feels like a much closer third person than I wrote when I was younger, because I've now learned how to get close to my characters. In fact, it was funny, it's totally aside, but it'll be quick. When I was writing my first book, I'm not a natural, because I raised 2 kids. I'm not a natural foul mouth a person. Like if I hit my hand with a hammer, of course I'm going to swear, but it just wasn't something I did a lot when the kids were young, obviously. And then when I was writing Cassie, she swears, my first character, and I would come downstairs and I would just say something and I would just drop an F-bomb. And my daughter, who was a teenager at the time, was like, you were writing, weren't you? Because it does influence who, your characters influence you. And so I was like, kind of, now I feel a little bit more assured in my approach, and I feel like I could try new things, and it's fun. I've kind of established the foundation. I feel like I know what I want to write. I know what kind of voice I have. And now I know I like short and pacey chapters. There are certain hallmarks that are things that I like to read that I now write. So, but now I can play with structure a little bit and point of view a little bit and have fun with it, I think.
Okay, great. When did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
When did I decide I wanted to be a professional writer? Or when did I decide? I got, when I was graduated high school, I got the best writer award for my high school class. I always wanted to be a writer. I always wrote, started with poetry. I got my first $3 check from a regional Kansas magazine when I was young. I don't remember, 10 maybe. And then I actually maybe younger, maybe 8. It was very young. And then I switched to darker fare when at 11, I read my first Dean Koontz book. And I was like, oh yeah, let's go dark. Forget these happy feely poems. Let's do something dark. And that's like, I mean, when my grandfather passed away, they found in his safe one of the first, like my first book was called Rabbit's First Christmas. And then my second book was, when I was in middle school, was about a killer at a summer camp. So, totally went a different direction. Yeah, so I've always known. I didn't feel comfortable enough showing people my writing until after No Bad Deed. And like I said, it was my agent, my amazing agent, was the first person to read it. I felt like I can trust people, and that was scary. That was so scary to say, here, read this book here, stranger, read this book that I've poured my heart and soul into. And so once I took that step, it was like no looking back, though. It was like, I love this. I should have been doing this long before, but.
That's it.
I have to unmute myself because the dogs think it's dinner time. And all of a sudden there was this barrage of barking out there. So I didn't want to spoil this by having them intrude on it. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for spending almost an hour with us. Before She Finds Me, wonderful book, at any time. But since we're all looking now for summer reading and, beach reading and all that good stuff, this would be an excellent choice for you. Fortunately, we have copies for sale at the Poison Pen. Amazing. So I will look forward to actually seeing you in person in California. And I will be coming to you from Dean Koontz because we're going to get together on my way over there. So, if he's a hero of yours, I will let you know.
Oh my gosh. Just tell him I love him. That's all. That's all you have to do. He was the first author I approached for a blurb.
Yeah.
And he didn't give it. He said he was too busy, but he gave me a handwritten letter about, wishing me luck and everything. And I'm like, oh.
He's a very kind man and would like to be supportive. He has a work-driven ethic that's hard to imagine. But he's very kind. We email back and forth. I email and he has someone who reads the emails and writes them out for him. And, so it's an interesting experience, but it's been a real joy of the last maybe 10 years to spend time with him because, when somebody is that seminal and that celebrated, it's pretty scary to sort of like handing over your book to your agent.
Yeah.
And I've observed, and I was guilty of it too, most people, when they meet somebody like that, are sort of bereft of both speech and thought and say something like, I'm your biggest fan. Or, we all say something completely stupid in moments like that. So I'm grateful that I've had a chance to actually learn to talk to her.
At 11, whispers changed my life. So
I will tell him.
Yeah, that is that, that's his book made my career.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that will mean a lot to him to know that. And it's as I say, he's a remarkable person. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure. So thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you. We are definitely, you almost look like, hilariously, you're wearing a hat because where the sun is hitting your head, it's all gone blonde. It's so interesting. I see. So I think we're going to need to get you a black screen or something for he's got a west-facing window, and it's just that wrong thing. The good news is that today's the 22nd, and we're losing daylight every single day, which in Arizona is a joy. I have a friend from Alaska who spends part of the winter with us, and she always says on December 22nd, yes, we're getting daylight. We're gaining daylight. So I always say to her on June 22nd, yes, we're losing daylight. Go for it. Right. So anyway, everybody, thanks for spending time with us. Enjoy your evening.